Turn your Bibles to Isaiah chapter 30. This week we've been teaching about grace. There's so much grace. But what throws us off is there's so much grace available, but there's this big waiting period, a difficult gap between you're praying and asking and being aggressive and seeking, and by the time you get it, there's a gap, and we lose people in that gap all the time. Just like when you step on an elevator or a subway train, it says mind the gap. Christians should mind the gap. We lose a lot of people in the gap, and the gap is called waiting. And everything that God does, whether it's a prophecy, whether it's a promise, whether it's a journey, he promises Abraham that he's going to have not just a son, but the father of nations. And it was 25 years that went by before Sarah actually conceived. So you have to ask yourself, why did God promise it and then wait? Unless there's something in the waiting that's really critical. And if you could understand it, and I wish someone had taught this to me when I was starting out, because it would have saved me a lot of stress, a lot of wear and tear in my soul. But Isaiah chapter 30, verse 18 says, "Therefore the Lord will wait, that he may be gracious to you. And therefore he will be exalted, that he may have mercy on you. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for him." So he includes a waiting element to everything he does. Very, very rarely do you pray 1 minute and then get it the next. Or you get a prophecy and you have it fulfilled right away. It can happen, but it's usually because very likely you've been waiting you've been in a process of waiting anyway, and it's just him giving you that final release. But for the most part, all the prophecies, all the promises that God's given me, it's required enormous amounts of waiting. But he's doing it to be gracious to you. He's not withholding any good thing from you. There's something more than you getting your promise or your prophecy. There's something more than you just coming into your gift or your calling. There's a braiding together. And the word waiting here is the Hebrew word quava, and it has to do with the Strong's Concordance. Dr. Strong's describes it as twisting. It's like braiding. And so what happens is you've got your mind, your will, your motives, your methods. He's got his mind, his will, his motives, his methods. And what he wants to do is he wants to put his in your heart. And so during the waiting time, the waiting isn't sitting with a clicker in your hand watching movies or playing video games. Waiting in that sense, it's actually work. I call this sermon the work of waiting, where you're actually being twisted, you're being braided together with him, so that in the end, you think like him, you feel like him, you respond like him, you act like him, your motives are like his motives, your mind is his mind, because you've been braided, you've been kneaded together, twisted together. And that's actually the work that he's trying to do. That's the process. And there's a lot that has to happen. When you get a word or you get a vision, I remember being a brand new Christian, getting visions from the Lord about my future. And I wanted it so bad that I had to become willing to wait. And I thought when he said that he was going to do these Joseph things in me, these great things in me, that it would happen. I didn't even want to work, because I thought it was going to happen any minute. And I didn't realize it would be years before it would come to pass. I thought if he said it, why wouldn't he just do it? It had to be imminent if he was promising it. It's kind of like a story of Moses. There's two parts to the story that are really important. If you want to go to Exodus 24:12, the Lord calls Moses up into Mount Sinai, and he downloads an amazing revelation that the world had never seen anything like the Ten Commandments. It was a revelation of God that no one knew God like that, not even Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They did not know the Lord like Moses was getting this revelation. But it's not just about Moses, it's also about Aaron. He prophesies about Aaron and what his role as a priest was going to be like. He prophesies about the people and what kind of nation they were going to be. And so here's this, I'll set it up this way. This is my version of it, my story. You can imagine all the people standing. There's 2 million people or more on this flat plain in what's today modern Saudi Arabia. And Moses is invited to come up into this mountain that's on fire. We have an aversion to walking into fire. Not only that, there's a local earthquake and rocks are flying and splitting, and there's the sound of rocks breaking, and there's a local earthquake on the mountain, and it's smoking, and there's lightning, strobe lightning over the mountain, plus there's this really weird, eerie trumpet blaring. And here they are, all standing there watching this mountain vibrating, smoking, lightning, and God says, come up here. And so Moses has to leave the safety of the crowd and walk toward this thing and begins to make his way. They watch him disappear in the smoke. And he's called up into this local lightning storm. And when the Lord spoke to him in Exodus 24:12, he said, come up and be there. So that's all he has, is be there. So if you can picture you being Moses for a few minutes as I tell the story. So you're going up, you're leaving the people, you're leaving the crowd, you're going toward lightning and fire and an earthquake and this eerie trumpet sound. And you get there after a few hours of hiking up into this mountain. It's actually a mountain range. It's still there today. In fact, the rock is burned. It's just all blackened from the fire. You can go there, you can see it. It's on YouTube. But he's there, and all he has is be there. So you can imagine he's waiting around for an hour, looking at a sundial. Nothing happens. 2 hours. 3 hours. God said, be there. I'm here. I'm here. 4 hours. Finally, he starts to see it's going to be a long night. He wraps his tunic around him. And he finds some kind of hollow out section of a little niche in the rocks. And he covers himself up and he sits there and he's waiting. God's going to show up. I don't know if you've ever spent the night in the wilderness before. I have. It's a longer night than anything you have at home. There's nothing like a night in the woods by yourself. And you hear every sound. And it's cold. And it always gets colder before dawn. And so he's bundled up. But God said be there, so he's there. The sun starts to come up and peak. And he feels the first rays of sunshine. And the mountain is still going crazy, but it's another day. And so he hasn't had breakfast and he's waiting. God says, be there, I'm here. Nothing happens all day. And he starts going into another cycle of another night of cold, another night of being alone. There's no food, there's no water, there's nothing. All he has is a word that says, be there. He passes a second night, and then dawn breaks. He's stiff, he gets up, he walks it off, he walks around, checks his sundial again. Did I hear this right? God said to be here. Where's God? Another long day. I mean, just a long day. And plus, it's a weird place. You miss your church. You miss food. You miss normalcy. You miss activity. You have three choices. You can kneel, sit, or stand. And there's nothing else to do. The Wi-Fi reception is terrible. There's nothing on. There's nothing to do. You find a different rock to sit on. There's no wood to chop. I mean, you would just... Moses is like you. He would be a worker. There's nothing to do. Nothing to eat. Nothing to cook. Nothing to prepare. A third day goes by. And another long night. This goes on for 7 days. And then all of a sudden, God shows up and downloads the most amazing revelation that anybody has ever received. He began telling them how he wanted this people for himself. He brought them out of Egypt. He gave them laws of a kingdom where he would be the God of the kingdom. He'd be the king. How they're to live, how they're to relate to each other, how they're to approach it. They had never had any concept of worship before, no concept of forgiveness. Forgiveness didn't exist for anybody before this. Adam never asked for it, and God never offered it. It was pre-forgiveness. And God begins to download this amazing revelation and writes it himself on a stone with his own finger. Moses saw this happening. Carved out with a laser of his finger, carved out the stones and wrote it. And he begins talking about not only the people, but he begins to describe Moses' brother. And he says, he takes about 4 chapters to describe Aaron from right down to his underwear, what kind of underwear he'd wear and what kind of hat he'd have and how he'd approach God as the priest on behalf of the people and how sin would be dealt with. And he's describing Aaron and all Aaron's sons forever. And then all of a sudden God says, get down now, get off this mountain. And Moses is shaken because he's in the middle of this amazing revelation. And Moses starts making his way down, and he comes down. There's a young guy named Joshua who's waiting for him. And Joshua is shaken. He says, it sounds like war in the camp. And Moses says, no, it's not war, it's a party. And he goes down, and here's Aaron. He's completely naked. His hair's a mess. His beard's a mess. They've been feasting and partying. He's drunk. He's made this golden calf, and he said, this is the Lord who led you out of Egypt. And the people are naked, they're sleeping together, they're drunk, it's a party, it's been going on for days. And he said, what are you doing? He said, the people made me do this. And I, as far as I just threw gold in, and this is what came out. And he wouldn't take any responsibility for it. And judgment fell. It was a mess. You can read about this in 1 Corinthians 10, I believe, where he talks about the judgment of God that came upon the children of Israel because of this. So here he is in the mountain. He's describing Aaron. The reality is, on the ground, Aaron's leading the people in idolatry and sexuality and drunkenness. There's a gap between what he saw and what he was. And I've seen so many young people where they get a prophecy, a vision, and they think right away that that's who they are. And then they go through the mill. They go through a really difficult, long waiting time, and it feels like they're backsliding, and it feels like they're not doing very well. And they said, but God said, I'm this, but the reality is I'm struggling. It happens to everybody. The people that he was describing as a holy nation were not very holy on the ground. But they were going to become that, but there's a gap between what God says and what we are. There's a gap, there's a process, there's a wilderness subtracting process that he takes us through. He took Moses through it, he took the people through it, he took Aaron through it, and eventually Aaron and his sons are all decked out in these amazing priestly garments doing what God said, but it was a long process to get them there. There was a lot of twisting, a lot of braiding, a lot of subtraction, a lot of addition. When the Lord first gave me a vision of what I was to be and what I was to do, I said yes to it. And then he said, but I'm going to take you through the wilderness. I didn't even know what he was talking about. He said, you're going to spend a lot of time in the wilderness. I found out that's where men of God, and I say that meaning not sexually men, but not gender, but people of God are made in the wilderness. And the messages that we get are all formed in the wilderness. And the wilderness is a place of humbling and subtraction and loneliness. And the loneliness is of God. And it seems like punishment that, why would I be so lonely? Well, that's part of the process, and that's part of waiting. And no one really understands it, and you're misunderstood. It looks like nothing's happening, and you've been promised things, you've seen things, because there's always this gap. And then all of a sudden, God brings you up, and you're standing in the very thing that he said, but you know by that time you've been through such a humbling, subtracting, painful, disciplinary period that you know you didn't get there by yourself. You know that God was the one that got you there, and it doesn't go to your head. You don't take any credit for it. It's like Alex Haley, who was a very famous author back in the 70s, and in his office was a big photograph of a turtle on a fence post. And when people would come into his office, they'd always see that turtle on the fence post. And they said, what's that photograph of? He said, well, that photograph reminds me that I didn't get here by myself. So waiting is part of the process. There's nothing that God doesn't do. He doesn't include an element of waiting. Moses had to wait. If you go with me to James chapter 5. James chapter 5. We learned something else about waiting. Another waiting story.